everyone, and welcome to today's meetup. Today we are talking about something that I think we all agree is a very important topic when it comes to AI adoption and businesses integrating AI into their organizations, and that is compliance. I know, being in conversations with Matt, something that he always talks about is how a lot of businesses want to get the value and see how it can drive change and transformation within the organization, but there's always this hesitation for fear that if you adopt AI, you're not going to work with the compliance. So today, Matt, our partner, is joined by Riaane, the CEO of the Compliance Institute of South Africa. He's also joined by our very own Eric Newby, head of product here at Ecosystem. Together, they are going to discuss the kind of ins and outs of responsible AI adoption and how you can integrate it within your business, but still work with compliance, not against it. So first of all, we are recording this session and the recording will be available on our YouTube. Please feel free to ask any questions or make comments. You can raise your hand or drop them in the chat and I'll read them aloud. So I'm going to hand over to Matt now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Madison. Hi, everyone, and good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. I see a whole bunch of new faces and a lot of people in places that have tons of compliance and faces and names I've definitely chatted to both in my past and recently. I've got to admit, having spent most of my career selling technology and solutions, I've tried my best to know the least about compliance and stay far away from governance, compliance, procurement, and those sorts of things. More recently, I'm gravitating towards really understanding and knowing it. So the more I get into conversations and go through the sales cycle, the more I need to understand about compliance and governance, especially when you start with this fantastic, innovative AI concept. Slowly, as we whittle through the sales process into proof of concept, is a fantastic idea carved away into almost something that's valueless because of just a lack of understanding and a lack of knowing around what we're allowed to do and what we aren't allowed to do, even more so what AI can produce and can't produce. For me, I'm in a position now where I get to talk about explainability and privacy and things like that, and knowing them at a deeper level without having just to use the buzzwords. I'm super excited to have Riaane here, who's the CEO of Compliance South Africa, who's also the chair on the board of the International Federation of Compliance Associates. Riaane also brings a real international flavor to this conversation. And I've got Eric joining me, who is head of product and has some war wounds from his days at Discovery Bank and having to introduce AI and understand the compliance around introducing it into a new bank. So thank you guys for joining me. I would like to kick off with spending a little bit of time with you, Riaane, just understanding if you could be a leading voice in compliance, just if you can explain and share a bit more about Compliance Institutes of South Africa and what you do for organizations.
Sure. Thank you, Matt, and thank you for allowing me into the call. I'm hoping that by the end of the call, it will be a completely different feeling that you might have about compliance. I think just to kick off about the Compliance Institute Southern Africa, in the South African environment, we are actually world leaders in the sense that we have professional bodies recognized by the South African Qualifications Authority. So just a quick word on that. If you will be used to the university kind of setup, you go to classes, have parties, write exams, and hopefully pass, and then get your degree, which is pretty much yours for life. How we are different in professional bodies is that we actually issue designations, not qualifications, and sometimes people call these certifications. A designation is issued primarily because the person has specific work experience as required by that specific designation. As an institute, we are the professional body allowed to assess the candidates for these designations. We take them through board exams. We definitely assess their work experience. That's a key component. And then we can issue these designations. We've got three. I'm not going to go into detail, but we've got the Compliance Practitioner SA or CPRAC SA. We've got Compliance Professional SA or CPROF SA. That's the more strategic one. And then we've got our new one, the Anti-Money Laundering Compliance Practitioner SA or AML CPRAC SA. And all three of these designations are registered on the National Qualifications Framework. So it has the necessary gravitas and support from the educational environment. We are also a member, as Matt has said, the Institute is also a member of the International Federation of Compliance Associations, IFCA for short. The members of IFCA are not individuals. They are the compliance institutes or associations from the member countries. So we've got Ireland, Spain, Australia, Nigeria, Argentina, the US has just signed one of the biggest ones in the world, just to give you a flavor. And why that is important is a couple of things. Firstly, when you get our designations in South Africa, and our program has been vetted by IFCA, you automatically get that international certified compliance professional designation as well. We are working on the anti-money laundering one, so that will come out soon. The other thing that is quite important from that international flavor you mentioned is that we get to discuss amongst each other, and we have regular events where we hear from across the world what is the latest in AI, in regulation, and not just AI, but all legislation. And we really get to hear from people that are in the thick of things. So quite a useful collaboration there. And then I think the other thing that's quite important, especially in light of today's discussion, is that we as an institute and IFCA as the international body give inputs, and we also have compliance standards, so best practice standards. How do we actually do compliance? It is a risk-based approach, so it's not a legalistic approach to compliance, which means that we have to really understand as compliance officers, Matt, back to your point, where I think there was maybe in the past, there is definitely this feeling of compliance is the business prevention officers. And so we're really trying to move away from that perception and to really become business partners. We also do a lot of thought leadership. AI is, of course, top of the pops right now. We make sure that our compliance community stays abreast of all these developments worldwide, and specifically in South Africa for our association.
Thanks, Riaane. Staying with the theme around AI, what are you seeing from your vantage point as the most pressing challenges organizations are facing when adopting AI? And so AI and other technology.
Yeah, at the risk of, I hope there are no compliance officers on the line that I'm going to alienate now, but compliance officers normally, and not always, they're very comfortable with legal stuff. They can read an act almost as well as ChatGPT can. I'm just joking, ChatGPT I think will beat them, but well, we can read acts, we're comfortable with words, we're not comfortable with Excel as an example, most of us, they are that are, but we have in the compliance community people coming from the accounting side of things or auditing side, as well as the more legal side. So it depends on the individual, but by and large, I would say not comfortable with this environment. So the moment you're talking about data and technology, AI, it creates fear. There's a lack of understanding, the lack of engagement. I think then the other challenges that I think right now, if we just speak about AI, is of course very immature and very fragmented regulatory environment. So yes, we've got the EU AI Act, quite a comprehensive piece of legislation. But the moment you start to go to other countries, they have different versions of this, they have their own insights. If you go to China, very low emphasis on data privacy, which for us in the Western world, it's unthinkable. If you go to China, there's no such thing as your data is your own. Now they can teach the AI on data. It's quite different regimes and environments. So I think those are the key things right now. And then I think there are very few businesses that have really grappled with this, that have really sat down and said, this is our AI strategy. So very, very early days. And all of this plays into making it quite a kind of environment for most people right now.
I mean, it's really interesting you're talking about the different regions because, reading and understanding this, I read a fantastic book, AI Superpowers, and it talks about different regions, talks about Silicon Valley, it talks about China and how they're grappling with AI and who's going to win the AI race. And it's written by a Chinese author. He feels that China is going to win the race because of the compliance rules and laws and the data privacy laws and rules. In fact, they've got a region where there's sort of no rules, if I can use that, where they allow to experiment and do as much as they like and can to enable innovation. Then you hear stories around all these sort of the startups in Europe are leaving because of GDPR and all these rules and regulations that have been put on businesses that just can't get up and get going because of they're so scared to break compliance. What are we following? What are we looking at? Or are we carving out something of our own?
I think when Europe sneezes, South Africa catches a cold. We tend to look at EU legislation, and I don't think it's a bad place to look for leading legislation. We had the same with GDPR. POPIA is very closely aligned to GDPR. I think it's going to follow the same kind of thing with the EU AI Act. We already have in South Africa a policy that's out for public comment, or the comment period might be passed by now. It's a very flimsy little document, 13 pages. So it's really just high-level first thoughts that we're seeing in South Africa. Right now, I think the emphasis, as it should be, is that, yes, it's a new tool or a new world that's emerging, but we really need to think about the principles at play here. If you go back to those principles kind of thinking, you will then get to, there are actually quite a number of acts already in South Africa. Although it's not an AI-specific act, many of the things that are playing into the AI world are actually governed and regulated. So if I think about things like POPIA, data privacy as an example, there's the cybercrime bill, I can't remember the exact name, the Electronic Communications and Transactions Act, the Companies Act, don't forget the Companies Act, that places liability and accountability with the governing body of a company. And then, of course, you've got things like treating customers fairly, Consumer Protection Act, those kind of things. So these principles are, if you keep them foremost in your mind as an organization and you now want to embark on your AI journey, those are very good places to make sure that you've got them in your compliance universe and keep them close. And I think this is maybe another challenge. It's one thing to understand something like the Data Privacy Act, to understand that, and we've implemented it now. We've like 2 or 3 years post-implementation, or when it was promulgated and became effective. I think the challenge is for businesses and compliance officers alike to say, yes, we understand the principle, but how does this actually play out in the products that we want to develop? And for that, you really need to have a firm understanding of, firstly, the act and these acts, what are they saying? And then secondly, how's this going to play out in an AI world? The terminology, the how is going to be different.
Okay, that makes sense. Eric, I'm going to turn to you. You not only have to think about compliance when building out the ecosystem platform and making sure that the platform's compliant. The beauty of it is a lot of the platform has been built in client space and adhering to the banks, insurers, and telcos who are our clients. You've also come out of a world where you were building behavioral science and AI in a new bank and had to consider the compliance and governance hurdles. How did you navigate those in your earlier days before you came to ecosystem.Ai, and how do you navigate them now?
Sure. One thing that resonated with me is finding someone who is a risk-based compliance person. That makes a huge difference. If there's someone you can work with, discuss things with, and solution with, you can really get a lot done. I think if those people do exist, you can still bump into people who are like, this is the box. I decided before the meeting what I was going to say, and nothing you say in the session is relevant to what I'm going to say. But there really are people who will work with you to find a way to achieve what you're looking to achieve, even if it's not in the way that you initially wanted. I think I include those people as early as possible in the process, because what often happens is people come up with all these ideas and ways of doing things and build this whole thing, and then right at the end they're like, oh yeah, we also need to talk to compliance, and then the compliance will be like, oh, but this doesn't work. And you're like, oh, but the whole thing is based on that, and if I pull out that foundational brick, then the whole thing falls over, and then everyone gets grumpy. So I think it's about finding the risk-based people and engaging, almost like having them in your, like when I was at the bank, I had the compliance people in my weekly product sessions, and it's finding someone who's willing to do that. Even most of the time they were just sitting there listening, but if something came up that was a concern for them, they would raise it. I think having that sort of engagement is helpful. But something that we didn't have necessarily at Discovery Bank, but it needs to happen in a lot of organizations, is better structures and thinking about fairness and ethics in AI. And it's actually not even really an AI question. It's just a question that is forced to the front by AI. As an example, I don't know if you guys have been keeping track of the Section 59 investigation of the big medical schemes. It's been going on for a few years, but recently there was judgment passed finding the medical schemes guilty of discrimination in the way that fraud, waste, and abuse schemes are structured. Those systems are using AI AI isn't just ChatGPT, right? It's also kind of models and all those sorts of things. They were using AI to decide who to investigate, even though there's no AI Act they were discriminating. Legislation exists that you shouldn't discriminate. And Discovery, MedScheme, and someone else were all found guilty by this inquiry. Exactly what's going to happen is still to be decided. A big part of the reason that happened is they didn't have a AI fairness ethics framework in place from the beginning. It's not necessarily an AI question, but what does fairness mean for us as an organization? And I also think it's important because the AI people can also get involved in that discussion. It's not just a compliance discussion. It's like everyone can contribute to what do we, as an organization, believe that fairness is. And it's not trivial because you can't, there's papers, I can't remember exactly which one, but there's a paper that said you cannot satisfy every definition of fairness. They are mutually exclusive definitions of fairness in this context. So you have to make decisions and decide what do we think needs to be fair. We're not going to discriminate based on these different features and factors, or we want to give equal, make sure that it's balanced across different groups, going back to the Section 59 thing and the investigation based on race. Does being fair in that context mean we investigate people based on the race distribution in the country? Or does it mean we don't look at race? Or does it mean we acknowledge that people in certain areas have different structures and we need to help them improve that? There's a lot of depth that needs to go into that discussion. And there's a whole lot of tools that once you've had the discussion you can use. So you can say, okay, to be fair in our AI space, we believe that this should be what happens. And there's technical tools to achieve that. But until you've, as an organization, with your compliance people said, this is what we believe is fair, maybe it's not. And I think a lot of South African legislation is written with gray in it. So it won't be this is the rule. And if you as an organization can't go to your tribunal and say, yes, we know this is the principle, this is how we interpreted it, this is what we did, you get into a very difficult discussion where you're trying to justify things using very technical concepts. We've seen now that doesn't work, at least in this specific case. I think if most organizations have that discussion and agree what is fair, it will line up with the legislation. It will almost make the compliance piece easier, because it might be a few things here and there that, maybe something like credit scoring, maybe the compliance, the legislation is behind, technically what you can do, you have to adjust that. But I believe that, if you've actually, as an organization, thought about what do we believe is fair, what do we want to ethically do with this AI, you'll automatically solve any compliance problems, especially if the compliance people are risk-based in the room. So my past view on it is find the risk-based people and keep them included. My future-looking view is fairness and defining fairness and thinking about it as an organization is very important.
That's very interesting because, Riaane, you and I chatted about this not too long ago around, especially AI uses a lot of data, and you can't get away from history. We have this history, and now you have systems and models using the data that has history. Without opening a complete can of worms, how would Compliance South Africa advise and work with organizations that want to be as fair as possible? I have no doubt that organizations like Discovery and MedScheme want to be as absolutely fair as possible, but at the same time want to be as innovative and deliver phenomenal customer service and great products as well. I think
you're muted.
I don't know how that happened. I think it was AI. I really liked what Eric said. First, have your definition of what that is. That should be in a policy. Think about all these things and then decide up front, what is your stance on them? Informed by the company's values and how they want to be perceived in the market. Then from a risk-based approach, one of the things that I really like about the risk-based approach is that it's quite a logical sort of structured framework. We apply ISO 31000 and ISO 37301. And those are risk-based principles. And what that means is one of the things that you have to do is identify the risk. Once you've got your risks identified, you need to understand the root causes that can cause that risk to materialize. If you look at AI, root causes can be things like the data is tainted or biased. It could be that it's intentional. It could be that it's unintentional. It's just, like we said, the history of South Africa comes from a place of inequality in its past. You're not going to erase that now, but that's a root cause that you need to manage. Because if you understand the root causes of these things, then you can manage it. You can put in the necessary controls and so on. So if you think about something like ability, is another example. If you look at an AI model, you say that's a black box, we don't really know what's going on in there. That's an explainability issue. The root cause could be, and Eric, I'm in your territory here now, but I read a lot, I've sort of tried to keep track of these things. But for explainability, it could be that the machine or the AI is taking shortcuts because it's wanting to get to the solution as quickly as possible, and now it's lost the ability to track chain of thought or to show how they thought of the process of getting to the solution. Then you need to adjust your model. Those are important things to understand and take up front. Yes, we're going to adopt AI, but what are those things, that the values that we have, and regulation for that matter, that we must absolutely hit every time and make sure that we comply.
I did see a hand up. Madison, did you want to?
Yes, I did see a hand, but I think it's been lowered. Now we have a hand, Adrian.
Yeah.
There you go. Sipamanda, I think it was your hand that was raised. Whoever wants to go first, please go ahead.
Everyone is muted, including Madison, who was trying to tell everyone that everyone is muted. You're also welcome to put your questions in the chat.
Hello. Can you hear me? Yes, my question is on Riaane and Eric. There's a bit of a blur in the corporate world as to how you supplement these AI usages with Grok, ChatGPT to your day-to-day job descriptions, because I mean, sometimes whether you're a software developer, systems architects or whatever, you're going to reach a hurdle and then you're going to probably want to prompt AI to get an answer. In your typical experience, what is allowed and not allowed when you are using these platforms to aid in your day-to-day job descriptions? What is the typical constraints that one has to keep in mind, considering some corporations typically don't have an AI policy to govern such usage? What can you say about that? Both Eric and Riaane.
I think from my point of view, generally what most organizations want is that the data you are giving to that AI is not leaked. So whether it's proprietary code or you accidentally include PII in whatever prompt you're setting, you want to have either you're running it locally so it's completely walled off, or they have an agreement with Microsoft or OpenAI, whoever is supplying that tool. I think to just use the publicly available versions of Claude and ChatGPT would generally be discouraged. I definitely think it's worth having a discussion with the organization before you do that. Potentially they're comfortable with it, but I think almost universally they would rather have either something that stays completely within their environment, so it's just running locally and you can query that, or something where there's a contractual agreement with the model provider that data will remain isolated and not be leaked to anyone else.
I've seen some organizations so spooked by this that they have a complete moratorium on, you are not allowed to use any of these commercially available, or even if most of them are open source, they say, yeah, but they don't want you to use them at all. So what they would rather do, and that does come at a price, they would rather buy the Microsoft Copilot licenses, then, their staff can use that. So that's what I've definitely seen, a complete prohibition on the use of these tools. And then, as Eric has said, definitely the caution about the data, not allowed to use any company or other sensitive data in there. But I think the other thing that I've seen is where they actually train their staff on the responsible use of these AI tools, if they do allow the ChatGPTs and the Claudes of the world, understand what those settings are in those tools, that you can set your privacy to a certain, you can set it to not remember stuff that you put into it, etc. And it might not be fail-safe. I think those things are also a little bit nebulous. That's the spectrum that I've seen on my end.
Okay, thank you so much.
Sure.
Adrian, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I hope you can hear me now.
Yep.
Yes.
Thank you. Sorry about that earlier. Great time for the mic to break. Yes, I worked for a company where we developed a AI recommendation platform from a large multinational. And what I noticed in that were some really interesting conversations, and shall I say avoidance of conversations between AI R&D guys and compliance guys. Now, the guilty parties shall not be named, but you even have executives saying to the guys, listen, just please don't tell compliance about this, because compliance is just going to, we just don't want to go through that right now, having to explain this. So then we'll do the research, and once we know that this works, we'll figure it out. But like really, just, and compliance coming and saying, well, guys, the models need to be unbiased, and AI guys going, all models are biased. Duh. And so, you know, the whole problem there coming in that you're having these two groups of people who are not seeing each other as allies, right? There's a very contentious relationship between the two, in my opinion. Compliance comes in right at the end where people want to get a tick box that says, okay, yes, we can take this thing into production because we are compliant. The language just isn't there, so there's this massive divide. And the devs don't always realize, and the engineers don't always realize the risk that they're exposing the organization to. So my question is, what do we see going forward? Is it a case that our compliance people need to become a lot more hands-on in the tech, not just speaking the language, but truly understanding the engineering principles behind it? Is it a case that the techies need to become a lot more familiar with compliance? Is it a bit of both? Is it maybe a new role where this is a different type of role going forward, where it's not a compliance person, it's not an engineer, it's a something in between who is deeply involved in the design process, in the engineering process, has businesses' interests at heart, has the techies' interests at heart, but is in the meantime also saying, guys, just be careful. What you're doing is cool, but you're creating a fine line.
I'd say yes and yes, Adrian. This is like a dance, and both parties are part of this dance, so we need to make it happen. So yes, compliance officers definitely have to become not just AI literate, but at least a little level deeper than that, to be able to hold a conversation and understand the conversation while it's going on. Equally, I would say from the techie side, definitely a realization and an appreciation of, you know, what are the regulatory requirements. And if they don't like it, to become part of that process. As much as we want compliance to be involved as early as possible when you're developing something, I would say the technology guys also need to be involved, because compliance has this forum. You know, we do that. That's what we teach our compliance officers. Influence legislation. Be part of the discussions about new legislation. If you can't express and understand what this legislation is going to do to you from a technology and AI point of view, then best you have the guys in there that do, that can have that conversation. One other thing I want to mention, Adrian, on your point, is when the CEO or the executive says, don't tell compliance yet. There's a cultural problem there. So the one thing that you really want is for this to be a team effort. We all of us are actually part of the same organization. I would rather include compliance. Yes, they might irritate you because they don't speak your language all the time. But, you know, it's like teachers as well. We need to be part of it to understand it better. I happen to be an AI geek, so I read a lot about AI. But I'm certainly not an Eric that can start to develop these things.
Thank you.
I think there's another hand.
Hi, everyone. So I just wanted to revert to the point that you had made, Eric. I think the general point is valid. The specific example you used, I think, was unfortunate in that it's inaccurate. On the Section 59 inquiry, and so maybe I should note I'm someone of the Sugu Chief Digital Officer at Discovery. On the Section 59 inquiry, there was not if you read the media, if you actually read the findings of the inquiry, there's no finding against the model. The model was provided through the inquiry. It was evaluated by them, including elements of explainability, the key weightings that are used, and there was no finding on the model itself in relation to bias. What the finding was a general finding of consistency around specific biases in the model used by Discovery as well as MedScheme, sorry, by both Discovery and MedScheme in their findings. And there's a range of reasons for that, and they're detailed in the report, but it's not because of the model. So it wouldn't be a result of the lack of a framework that relates to accountability and appropriate ethical AI components. I think the general point itself is accurate in that organizations need to have that responsible AI framework. They need to have a set of principles. Those need to be implementable through the level of the models and how those models are engineered. You need to be able to trace for things like drift or things that are inconsistent with those ethical principles. I think that's valid. I just wanted to provide clarity on a specific example to say that actually is inaccurate.
Cool. Thank you. Well, I do think it actually raises an interesting thing is that I think that like I was saying, I think the fairness thing, it would be interesting to hear your view on being more embedded there. I think fairness is not an AI machine learning specific thing because it's not humans making the decision. It's being forced to the forefront because of this AI machine learning thing happening. Organizations should have a fairness discussion and a bias discussion. What does it mean to be biased and not fair to different parties? That filters down into AI, but also potentially to other areas. I don't know if that is something that was happening and it just didn't filter through correctly, if it wasn't happening and maybe it would have helped. But I think in my mind, it's broader than just AI fairness and a model drift. It's like, as an organization, what do we believe about these kind of complicated philosophical questions? Use that to inform your AI, but also other things. No, thank you very much for the clarification. I hadn't actually read the details of the findings, so it's good to know that.
Maybe to respond to that question, Eric, I think we can go into the details of the specific inquiry, but probably better to not do that in this session. In terms of the broader framework that relates to fairness, there is a responsible AI framework in Discovery. It was approved a few years back. I actually promoted that. And so that covers various ethical AI adoption principles, including things like fairness, transparency. And so that is used across all the AI initiatives, across the group. It's a group framework, so it includes even for the regions that are not in the South African composite or within the South African kind of product houses. So that does exist. I think what you are referring to is elements of corporate governance decision making, which is not the instance here. And I agree with the point generally to say organizations should have some guiding principles, some guiding structures, some processes that ensure compliance to those principles. It's just the specific example you used is not an applicable one, but I think the general principle that you're noting, I agree with.
Right. Thanks.
There's a question in the chat. This is from Henry. Isn't there a huge problem with determining bias and accuracy if AI systems do not reveal what data they are trained on and how they return results? Answer that, maybe.
You can do things with looking at what the results are. But definitely, there's a big problem with transparency and explainability. You can do some things with looking at what the results look like, given how you've defined fairness and all those sorts of things. But it is a concern. And again, I think it's worth thinking about the different types of AI as well. There are the big, like GPT, LLM AIs, like foundational models that, I mean, they will reveal their training data, but it's like the internet. So it's not that practically useful to know that. Whereas in practice, I think at the moment in organizations, a lot of the AI stuff that's actually impacting people is the slightly more traditional versions where people are training models based on data that they have available and using those results to make some sort of decision. In that case, you generally do have the data available. I do think it is a roadblock to it, but I also think at the moment, what's actually happening on the ground is more if companies training things using their data, then they do know what it is. So yeah, that's my view on it.
Thanks, Eric. Cool. There's no other questions I'm going to. Okay. When I started off, I spoke about Matt wanted to be becoming a better trusted advisor to his clients and to really embrace compliance in my conversations. What sort of advice would you give to somebody like me or anyone involved in business development around introducing AI-powered solutions? How do we build real trust with our clients, especially around data usage without triggering fear?
I'm fully on Eric's page here. When something new comes along, we start to look for new solutions and new ways of doing it. There's a lot in place already in many organizations. Let's not talk AI now. Let's just talk any other technology solution. What is it that you do? Especially if you're a large company, you would have some sort of a project management approach for new technology, whether it be AI or something else. There's got to be a business rationale for it. You've got to show what's going to be the ROI. Do you understand the strategy? What is it you want to achieve here? Have you done your risk assessments? Have you done your testing? Have you piloted it before you implement it? And especially if it's AI, do you have a continuous after implementation process that keeps checking on this thing? Because if you've got a self-teaching or self-learning AI model, the model changes. You can't now, what was still in place in project mode, you can assume that it's going to be okay for, forever going forward. So those kind of models, there are those kind of new things that have to be implemented. Then we also need to understand that there are certain things that are not going to be manageable with our current processes, tools, or whatever, but there are new tools available. Eric, you touched on that, but if you think about bias, there are tools out there that can actually test what is the probability of that there is a lot of bias in this set of data. There are tools out there that can check the reasoning of a model. We need to, as a technology team, understand what are the tools that are available today. Now, we're not talking maybe right now. AI is fairly immature still compared to where it can still go if you start to talk artificial general intelligence, not even touching on super intelligence yet. Let's talk AI. There's a new field of science emerging called alignment sciences. And what is that? Those are sciences where you check, these are sort of approaches, is this AI still aligned with my goals that I set out for this project, if you will? Is it still aligned with our values? So that is a whole new approach that you need to consider because it's AI. I think it's important to understand what the gaps are, what can we manage, because you also don't want to reinvent the wheel every time. You want to be able to lean on what worked well and trust that, because people trust that process. We've been doing it like this. So it's not that different. And there's a couple of new things that we have to just bring into the picture as well. So those are just some thoughts at this point.
Thank you, Riaane. Eric, you obviously had to do some internal selling and when adopting certain compliance hygiene. What sort of steps did you use to get buy-in faster?
So I think I think it really ties back into what I was saying earlier about finding the right compliance people to work with and having them there from the beginning and being willing to be flexible. It's not so much there's like, do these things. It's more just engage with the process in the same way that you want the compliance person to help you solve your problems. Also know that you need to help them solve their problems. I think there's often a bit of an us versus them feeling about things. But if you can acknowledge that they also have things they need to solve and deal with, and you can help them sort that out in the same way that they can help you figure out, how do you achieve what you, like I was saying before, how do you achieve what you want to achieve, even if it's not in the exact same way you were originally planning? I really think that's kind of what it comes down to. It's obviously difficult if there are no risk-based compliance people at your organization, and like Adrian was bringing up earlier, there's a big cultural problem. And that's something that needs to be solved at the top level. As an employee or a vendor, I don't think there are steps you can take to solve that besides raising it and informing people about the importance of getting it sorted out. As a cog in the machine, you can't really fix that very easily unless you kind of make that your new job, is my view. That needs to be in place, at least partially. Like I said, everyone has to be aligned with that, but if you can at least find someone to work with to make things happen and go into it with a good attitude, I think that's really the base of it. The rest you kind of figure out as you go along is probably a bit case specific.
A lot of the time I think about Amazon and Jeff Bezos, he's got those leadership principles. If you talk to the guys that work at AWS or Amazon, they bring these leadership principles everywhere they go. One of the guys I spoke to said sometimes it is frustrating in a meeting because there's 14 principles that contradict each other. And I just imagine now, let's have tech principles and compliance principles all together, and then make sure that we follow each of these principles in the meetings. It would probably prolong things and take a lot of the agility out of what we're doing. But being able to understand compliance and innovation in sort of one space would probably get things moving a lot quicker. And I think that's what our customers are trying to do. I think certainly, Riaane, when I've spoken to you, there's a lot of thinking around the layers of compliance and governance that have been built into organizations. Now, Eric, we were talking about Discovery Bank. It's a new organization, so you can kind of set the base. Some of the banks that I've worked with, 160 years of compliance, something happens and you don't redesign the process. It's just another layer of compliance that's thrown on top of it. For people like us that are trying to innovate and bring AI into these spaces, makes it incredibly difficult. I know we're going to wrap up now, but just to leave you with some food for thought. Any comments on that, Riaane, and then yourself, Eric, and then Madison, I'll hand over to you to see if there's any other questions.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. To close off from my side, this is a multi-pronged situation. There are many stakeholders, many players in this to make it work. Starting with, yes, the developers of these tools, like the OpenAI and Google and, all of these big players, there's a systemic risk there. So we need to understand what that means. Then there are the regulators. Regulators need to up their game. The easy thing for regulators to do is to make a principles-based kind of legislation where they leave it to the organizations to say how will we meet these principles or get to the expected outcomes. So I think that's the smart way to go for regulators. But in the organization, there's the 3 lines. They used to be called the 3 lines of defense. Those things still hold true. You might call them different things. They might have 1 or 2 extra layers, but it's about independence. It's about, yes, there are those developing these things, but how do we have oversight over it? And then most importantly, how do we assure back to the governing body? Because governing body has the ultimate accountability for all of this. And we need to give them assurance that everything is under control and within policies and principles that we want as an organization. But I think it's fascinating times. I absolutely love being part of it. So, Eric, if you're ever looking for a compliance officer to bounce some ideas around, I'm happy to do that.
Yes, thank you.
Eric?
I think the key thing is the compliance and the technical people need to be closer together and find a common language. I think what was interesting for me that Riaane was saying that I kind of knew but hadn't thought of it that explicitly before is I think, we say like AI specific, and there does need to be AI specific legislation, but a lot of the stuff on the outcomes of breaking the legislation is already legislated, so, you might short-term work around things, but at some point you're going to break a different piece of legislation because your AI is doing the wrong thing. You need to get ahead of that and make sure you have the right structures and governance in place. Get AI compliance and technical AI people talking to each other as early as possible and not feeling adversarial is the key thing.
Great. Thanks, both of you.